Hello, my name is Mark Nordenberg, and it is my privilege to welcome you to a special series of programs dealing with the critical and current topic, governing in crisis, preserving democracy, the rule of law, and American values. It is in times of crisis that people most need the support and protection of government. However, it also is in times of crisis that even core values can be severely tested, and when leaders are most likely to try to unilaterally expand their power. As we have grappled with the public health and economic challenges triggered by the spread of COVID-19, strains in our governmental systems have become increasingly visible. There have been tensions between the federal government and the states. There have been tensions between states and municipal governments. And there have been tensions between governments and the citizens they exist to serve. We also have seen troubling examples of departures from basic American values, including a lack of regard for the truth, diminished respect for science, resistance to long accepted forms of oversight, the exacerbation of inequality, and the erosion of such pillars of democracy as the sanctity of elections. For more than 3 decades, the University of Pittsburgh's Institute of Politics has provided a nonpartisan forum for the careful consideration of issues of importance to our home region and to the country. Throughout its 13-year existence, the Dick Thornburgh Forum for Law and Public Policy has made good governance one of its highest priorities. Of course, Dick Thornburgh himself has been an exemplar of and champion of good governance throughout his extraordinary career, a career that includes 2 terms as governor of Pennsylvania, service as United States Attorney General under 2 presidents, and service as Undersecretary General of the United Nations. Interestingly, though, one of his most celebrated accomplishments came early in his career, when he provided capable, caring, confidence-inspiring leadership in dealing with the crisis at the nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island, which came shortly after the beginning of his first term as governor. The presentation of these programs is a joint effort of the University of Pittsburgh's Institute of Politics and Dick Thornburgh Forum. The series is intended to help both policymakers and interested citizens, whatever their positions or political inclinations, to better understand the important governance issues that seem to be arising all too frequently these days. It is offered in the hope that we will emerge from this crisis not only with our economy restored and our values intact, but also on a committed journey to an even better America together. It is wonderful that Duquesne University President Ken Gormley is here as our first guest as we launch this Governing in Crisis series. I have known Ken for close to 40 years, which means that when I express enthusiastic respect for him, that is based on firsthand knowledge. When I say, for example, that he's an exceptional teacher, I actually have sat in on his classes. When I say he is an outstanding scholar, I actually have read his books and articles. And when I say that he is an extraordinary leader, I have been able to observe his enviable performances both as a law school dean and as a university president from a close vantage point. Of particular significance today is President Gormley's scholarship relating to constitutional law and the American presidency. He wrote Archibald Cox, The Conscience of a Nation, the authorized biography of one of this country's truly legendary legal figures who served as the first Watergate special prosecutor. Ken also wrote about the impeachment of President Clinton in The Death of American Virtue, Clinton versus Starr. That became a New York Times bestseller, and like his Cox biography, was recognized as one of the best books on American law in the year of its publication. His most recent book is American Presidents and the Constitution, A Living History. Among many other things, he also has written a treatise on state constitutional law and a history of the 1991 legislative reapportionment process in Pennsylvania, two works that have increased significance in light of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's decision striking down gerrymandered congressional districts as outside the scope of Pennsylvania constitutional law. Today, though, Ken, I want to begin not by asking you about anything you have written, but by asking you about something that someone wrote about you. Not too many Sundays ago, in a front page above the fold article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, this statement is attributed to you. Our country can make its biggest mistakes in times of crisis. What did you mean by that?
Well, before I answer that question, let me just say, since you did a long introduction of me, that our friendship, for people who don't know how significant it has been to me, dates back to when I first started as a young law professor at Pitt Law School. And then Professor Mark Nordenberg was the superstar professor there in the classroom, and obviously went on to do great things at Pitt. And your leadership there has been a model for me, Mark, in taking over this job at Duquesne. And so I thank you for doing this program too, because I think it's a wonderful opportunity for people to learn about really significant issues that don't come to the forefront very often. And so, yes, I did talk about in that Post-Gazette article the fact that the times of crisis are when we make our biggest mistake. And we've seen it over and over again in American history. And there's a good reason for it. When we're in that pressure cooker, when we're in the midst of a crisis, people are scared. Government officials are scared. They don't want something terrible to happen to the country or their state under their watch. And so it's unfortunately natural that they try to overcompensate and often make a lot of bad decisions then. And you also see the courts not wanting to make a mistake by getting in their way, and often allow them to get away with those mistakes during that time of panic. And it takes later the perspective of time to go back and correct many of these things.
Can we use the perspective of time and go back and ask you if you can quickly give us a couple of examples where executive overreach might have been approved by an acquiescent court?
Sure. Executive and legislative. I mean, when you think about, think of the crises, but in World War I, you had Woodrow Wilson and the Congress pushing through the Espionage Act, which really curtailed free speech rights by going after alleged subversives, often, people viewed to be socialists at the time, and just cut out their free speech rights. And the Supreme Court in Schenck versus the United States upheld that. And it took decades and decades for that to be corrected. During World War II, you had one of the most significant, one of the most vilified cases today, Korematsu versus the United States, where President FDR and his administration took Japanese American citizens, most of them, and moved them from their homes, just dislodged them from their homes on the West Coast and moved them to internment camps in the center of the United States that were not much different than prisons, quite honestly. And many of them lost their homes, they lost their livelihoods because there was a fear of Japanese saboteurs with no particular evidence against these people. And then when you move to more modern time, President George W. Bush, after 9/11, we found out later, and I had a chance to testify in Congress about this, authorized the NSA, the National Security Agency, to conduct a secret surveillance program, wiretaps, picking up telephone calls of US citizens without warrants who were talking to people overseas in really overreaching in order to get at potential terrorism. And so you've seen a lot of these examples during the most pressure-filled times when the government is taking those steps and lives to regret it.
Are there examples where courts were not as compliant and did step in and say, you've gone too far?
Oh, sure. And the granddaddy of the cases that I always talk about, and in fact is still the guidepost today in terms of the limits of presidential power, was the Steele seizure case during the presidency of Harry Truman. Harry Truman was, kind of feeling strong, feeling his oats as president. And during the Korean War, there was a labor stoppage of steel production, a battle between the steel companies and the unions, including right here in Pittsburgh along the riverbanks. So Harry Truman seized the steel mills and ordered them to continue to operate. Well, it moved swiftly to the Supreme Court, and they swiftly clipped his wings and said, no, you have gone above and beyond your constitutional authority as president. This is a domestic matter. Presidents have most of their power when it comes to foreign affairs. And not only did Harry Truman not have the assent of Congress in doing this, allegedly to protect the troops, Congress specifically passed a law as part of the Taft-Hartley law saying presidents did not have that power. They had to go to Congress to ask before they could do that. And so Harry Truman was quickly told he had gone too far, and it really damaged his reputation pretty much for the rest of his presidency. Similarly, George W. Bush, although early on after 9/11, he scored some big wins, we saw later on the Supreme Court in 4 cases, including the most conservative justices like Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court, saying he had gone too far when the government seized some combatants, enemy combatants in Afghanistan who turned out to be US citizens, and they put them in brigs in South Carolina and other places in the US and took away all of their rights. They weren't allowed to talk to lawyers. They didn't have any of the rights typically provided to US citizens. And the Supreme Court said that's too far. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor famously said, the times of war are not a blank check. And so many presidents have learned that lesson the hard way.
And you've been moving us closer to today, to move into really contemporary times. There was a day not long ago when President Trump declared that he had the absolute power to control responses to the pandemic as President of the United States. Is that declaration consistent with American constitutional law?
No, it's actually the opposite of the precedent and longstanding precedent. First of all, again, remember Harry Truman, it is Congress, when you're talking about domestic matters, that holds most of the power, not the president. And so Congress has a lot of power, as we're seeing it, as it passes stimulus bills to help workers who are unemployed, to help businesses try to get back on their feet, to help universities and others. And so Congress, and to pay for testing and other things that are necessary during this pandemic. But more importantly, Mark, the states have historically had most of the power when it comes to health, safety, and welfare. In constitutional law, they call that the police powers. And so it's the states who have historically had that power, which flows from, incidentally, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, reserving those powers to the states when this country was formed. And so there's a very important case from 1905, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, where the Supreme Court took a case where this gentleman, Mr. Jacobson from Massachusetts, didn't want to have to get a shot. There was actually an epidemic at that time, and he didn't want to get a vaccine that was mandated by the state. And it went to the Supreme Court, and they said, it really doesn't matter, Mr. Jacobson, that you don't like needles. This is necessary for the safety of other people, and you do have to get this mandatory vaccine. It's been true when states have prohibited radioactive waste from traveling through their states on railroad cars in ways that were unsafe, or diseased animals and other things. So this is a very key piece of state power. So both within the federal system, vis-a-vis Congress, the president is in a weak position. But when you compare it to the states have the strongest power when it comes to this type of health safety emergency that we're experiencing right now.
And of course, I think it was the very next day that the president retreated from the absolute power statement and instead suggested that the president and the federal government would perform more of a backup role. I don't know, just thinking about that, backup role doesn't seem quite right either. Is there some place between absolute power and being a backup where the federal government can play a significant role in helping advance the cause of fighting this pandemic?
Well, absolutely. I think the right word is facilitate. And the president specifically has a role here. And interestingly, it doesn't really flow directly from the words of the Constitution. And in that book on presidents and the Constitution, it's fun to look at the pieces of presidential power that aren't really formal, but just have developed. And one of them is what Teddy Roosevelt called the bully pulpit. You have this powerful megaphone as president. And so you're supposed to, in times of crisis like this, use that to facilitate the states, to help coordinate things, to help try to have a more unified approach to solving the problems. And the federal government has another role, of course, and we're seeing it on display. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. Those things, where did they come from? They were created by Congress during World War II when there was malaria sweeping the country during the war. And that was created by Congress and placed in the executive branch as an agency. So there it sits. And the CDC, as we can see, is giving us guidance and protocols, as it should, having to do with these health concerns. And then ultimately, it is the job of the federal government, Congress, and the president specifically to help the states work through all of that. The last thing they should do is get in the way.
Well, and since that exchange, it is clear that the responsibilities have shifted mainly to the state governors. And as the ones bearing that responsibility, they also are bearing some of the heat.
Right.
Part of that heat is coming from presidential tweets. Part of the heat is coming from citizen protests. And some of the heat is coming from litigation. I checked not long ago, and the governors of California, Colorado, Illinois, Kentucky, Michigan, Missouri, Nevada, Virginia, Washington, and Wisconsin all have been sued by someone. And of course, Governor Wolf also has been sued here in Pennsylvania. One of those cases, Friends of Danny DeVito, the legislative candidate, not the actor,
Right. Yeah.
versus Wolf, has already been considered by the state Supreme Court and, in a sense, by the U.S. Supreme Court. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Sure. And I am a big fan of Danny DeVito, the actor, I have to say, but not surprising. I didn't think this case was going to go anywhere, and it didn't. It was a real estate agent and this candidate for office, Danny DeVito, who said that he was at a disadvantage because he couldn't open his campaign headquarters, and the incumbent legislator did have an office. That was, first of all, this Pennsylvania Supreme Court did not accept those arguments and rejected them. And they part of the argument was that there was some sort of eminent domain taking without proper compensation. And they said, well, in a time of emergency like this, there's, you have to be able to, it's temporary, it's not permanent in nature. So it's not a taking under the Fifth Amendment. They also said there was no violation of due process. You can't announce in advance that you're going to have to take away people's property and shut down their businesses because of a pandemic. So there is due process after the fact, and they said that that was okay. And there was no violation of Mr. DeVito's free speech rights. He has a lot of, we see Joe Biden sitting in his bunker at home, campaigning from there. So there are other ways to communicate with voters. They didn't accept that. The Supreme Court, interestingly, as you know, Justice Sam Alito, who was here in the Third Circuit, based in Philadelphia, but part of the Third Circuit, did initially take the case and send it to the full Supreme Court to consider if they wanted to hear it. And they swiftly declined to do so, which came as no surprise. Part of the underlying argument was this broad notion that it was Governor Wolf's actions and his shutdowns were taking away the right to engage in business and conduct your business. Well, the problem is there is no such right under the Constitution. There was an old case, Lochner v. U.S. and Lochner v. New York in the early 1900s that suggested that that was repudiated. It's actually viewed as an example of exactly the wrong kind of decisions by the United States Supreme Court. So it didn't surprise me at all that that case went nowhere.
Well, you're bringing my mind back to con law days in law school, Ken. And I actually did enjoy reading that opinion. There were a couple of other things that stood out to me about it. The first was that the city of Philadelphia and the city of Pittsburgh actually filed Friends of the Court briefs in favor of the governor and the positions he was taking. And the second, because I have never written a treatise on Pennsylvania constitutional law, the sweep of the language in Article 4, Section 2, which gives to the governor, and now I'm quoting, supreme executive power, really did seem pretty powerful. And of course, that was also buttressed by language in the code that had been enacted by the legislature in terms of the governor's power to deal with disasters. Now, more recently, a group of counties kind of surrounding Allegheny County sued the governor in federal court in a case known as County of Butler versus Wolf. And here the counties were complaining about the fact that the governor had kept the entire southwest corner of the state in the red category rather than moving them to the yellow category, which would have given them more freedom to open up the economy. I guess from what you just said, I can predict your answer to this next question, but what do you think about the prospects of the plaintiffs in that suit?
Well, let me just say that it is, it is not likely again that they're going to succeed. And I also feel sympathetic. This is one of the things that you have to understand is that none of these, governor-led initiatives to deal with a crisis like this are going to be perfect. He has to act so swiftly to deal with, usually you take years to try to figure out something as complicated as this. He has to act like that to be able to make decisions. And so sometimes there will be individual people or individual counties or individual areas that will feel it's unfair. And it may be with respect to them, it is unfair, but for the common good, the governor has to have that power to make those decisions. And so while I think there's nothing wrong with them complaining about it, and by making a racket, that's how ultimately the governor will and has made changes. And in this case, some of these counties, as you know, were in that category because of a number of deaths in a single nursing home or in a particular area. And so they have a valid argument to make. But the part that sometimes people forget is he was elected governor, you weren't. And so you can raise those injustices, you can make the arguments, but if you start to defy the orders, that is not a good path to go down, because then the governor holds a bunch of cards. He holds all of the cards, quite honestly. He can decide you're not getting that crucial CARES Act funding from the federal government. And actually, I think the statute itself says you don't get it if you fail to comply with various laws. He could take away your liability insurance, your liquor licenses. He can do all sorts of things. So he has carrots and he has sticks. And so it's quite honestly rather foolish for any municipality to, it's a good idea to make known your strong disagreements, but to try to defy the decisions of the governor is not wise and not a good thing for your citizens.
Well, and as you said, the line drawing is tough. And in a way, it makes a lot of sense to treat the state as having been divided into regions for purposes of decision making. In the case we were just discussing, it really seemed as if the 4 counties who were plaintiffs didn't want to be a part of the region, because if they were a part of the region, then they were lumped with Allegheny County and its larger numbers associated with its larger population. They were lumped with Beaver County with the nursing home problems. And of course, within a matter of a few days, all of the Southwest region was moved into the yellow category, right, except for Beaver County. And now that is the county that has said they will defy the governor's orders and pretend, I guess, or act as if the order to stay in red didn't apply to them and to begin opening up. And as you said, it didn't take much time for the governor and the insurance commissioner to begin citing the tools that they believed gave them leverage in a situation like that.
And no governor wants to go down that path, Mark, but it always makes me think, when I was working on the Archibald Cox book, I did a lot of work with, when Cox worked in the Kennedy administration, the civil rights riots and uprisings in the South, and Bobby Kennedy and others went down there, including a guy, Burke Marshall, who I got to know very well, who was the head of the criminal division. And he talked about Governor Ross Barnett down in Oxford, Mississippi, defying the president. And I remember Burke Marshall saying, the president always wins. He can bring in the Army, the Navy. He can fire missiles on Oxford, Mississippi if he wants. You know, Governor Wolf has the state police, the National Guard. He doesn't want to do that. But it's a fool's errand to think that you're going to just stand up and defy the person who has all that power.
Though it is interesting, Ken, I was just down in Mississippi and traveled from Oxford to Jackson. And probably the biggest body of water in that state is the Ross Barnett Reservoir. So he is remembered by some as an admirable figure and remembered by others as the person who stood in the door at the University of Mississippi and told James Meredith, "You're never getting in here."
Right.
Well, enough with history. So we've got the governor moving forward with his stage opening up. We do have, at least initially, people in Beaver County saying that they're going to resist. That would be a form of civil disobedience. You know, what we also have seen in the recent past, Ken, is citizen protests against particular governors. I suspect that many Americans will retain the images from the state capitol in Michigan for a long time, with the protesters actually in the state capitol with weapons that many would describe as weapons of war. Do you have any reaction to that in terms of rights and wrongs, I guess?
Well, sure. This is true with respect to the individual citizens, just as it is with Beaver County or whatever. These individual citizens, we have a right to free speech here. They don't have that in many other countries. And so people can let their views known. I was driving through Mercer County last week and saw groups of people on the street corner honk if you support opening Pennsylvania. That's exactly what you do have a right to do, and to express those views. And incidentally, you're expressing those views so that your legislators hear it, so that Governor Wolf hears it, and you apply political pressure to make the political machinery work to accomplish what you want, which is incidentally why we've been moving into yellow, I think, because businesses and business leaders and citizens are exerting a lot of pressure. Where you cross the line, though, is if you start hinting at violence, you talk about violence, that is a crime. You don't have any protection from, doing something inappropriate there. And similarly, I should point out, if there is, if the governor has said that you need to wear masks to go into public places, if you try to burst into the Giant Eagle and refuse to wear a mask in going there, you are threatening the health and well-being of other people. This isn't just about you. This is about other citizens, and these are the rules that are in place. And so you could actually be in trouble for that as well. So it's a very careful line. And unfortunately, some of the tweets, as you mentioned, from the president have seemed to instigate that kind of behavior. Well, the president's on thin ice because, as we talked about, he doesn't have much power in this arena. He certainly doesn't have power to tell people to resist what the governors of their states are doing. And B, if people listen to him and commit these acts, they are going to suffer the consequences, not him, but them. So people have to be very, very careful about that.
I thought it was interesting that former Governor Ridge, a two-term Republican governor here in Pennsylvania and the first Secretary of Homeland Security for the country and a decorated Vietnam War veteran, wrote a very strong op-ed piece in the USA Today, really condemning these kinds of weaponized protests and saying that they really did a disservice to veterans.
Yeah.
I want to just shift gears for a moment as we're moving toward the end of our time. I thought it was interesting that when the Senate committee convened to hear Dr. Fauci and the head of the CDC and the head of the FDA, and there probably were others there too, the first question asked by the committee chair of Dr. Fauci had to do with whether or not the University of Tennessee was going to be able to open up in the fall. And of course, the eds and meds are so important in this region, but they're very important in many parts of the country. Can you say anything about how the leaders of the colleges and universities in this community are approaching the task of making decisions about whether or not there can be a safe opening, and if so, what are some of the steps to be taken?
Sure, that's a great question. It's what every parent and college student is asking right now. And let me just say, Mark, I feel very proud of how our whole region has responded to this. I mean, I'm on these daily phone calls, as most university presidents are, with Rich Fitzgerald, the county executive, and his health team, with Mayor Bill Peduto and his team, with the governor's team, including Noe Ortega, the deputy secretary of education. They have handled this very, systematically, calmly. They've listened to the various constituents, and I know everyone wishes it could go faster, but I'm also very proud of the collective college presidents in this region. We're all in a group, as you know, called Peachy. We have calls now 1 or 2 times a week, often multiple calls, sometimes with members of the governor's team and the local officials. And if you notice, we had a very coordinated approach when this first hit in March. We were all on the phone together, and we tried to act in concert with County Executive Rich Fitzgerald, with Mayor Bill Peduto, just putting the safety of the students and our, employees first. And I think because of that, it's one of the reasons we've done so well in Allegheny County in terms of the numbers being low, because we were on it right away. We were organized about it, and the leadership was there. And I'll say a word about your successor, Chancellor Pat Gallagher. He's particularly played a key role in working on a task force that's a statewide task force to help the governor's team and the Secretary of Education figure out how colleges and universities can move forward in the fall, hopefully, certainly with modifications. But I was on a call this morning with the group of presidents, and each of us has task forces and is putting together various scenarios. Right now, you can't predict where the virus is going to be when it comes to August. You can't predict what the governor is going to say or the rules and local officials, but you can begin to be prepared for all of these eventualities. And I think all of us really want to get back, to on campus, even if we have to modify and have, lesser density in classrooms or in the dormitories, and have, much more attention to hygiene and testing and things like that. All of that is going to have to be part of it. But I can tell you, as you know, I have a daughter who's just finished her sophomore year at Pitt, and I have all of my students who I talk to down at Duquesne. They really want to get back, and they want to see their friends. They want to be part of a university. That's what a university is for, that whole experience. And I was joking with someone today because I talked to a lot of our fellow faculty members and staff who have kids at home, and one person said there could be more, tragedy occurs if people are forced to stay at home, the parents and the kids, for a whole nother semester, because it's tense. I mean, it's a hard sort of thing. And so inevitably, I think the key is to figure out how to do this safely, and it's going to require discipline by everyone. But I will say, again, looking at Western Pennsylvania, but more broadly at the nation, there have been times through this when you can look at parts of Washington that have really seemed to be dysfunctional here, okay? But broadly speaking, you have people from all, the governors have acted wonderfully for the most part, all across the country, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. The people in local public office have done so. But the citizens mainly are the people who've made this work. This has not been easy, but they have come together and ignored all of that noise and done the right thing. And so fortunately, you have leaders in higher ed, you have leaders in government, but it takes the citizens to either discipline themselves and do this correctly or not. And they have done a wonderful job. So in the end, I predict when we look back in history at this, there will be some parts of it that look like were botched and were big mistakes. But the part we had right was that ultimately people came together and figured out how to deal with this unprecedented crisis for the common good. And that's what a society is for. And I think there's a lot to be proud of, despite the hardship that this has been, and it continues to be a hardship, but there's a lot to be proud of.
Well, it is said that hard times don't make character, they reveal it.
Yeah.
And I do think that a part of the character of this region, and certainly of the higher ed community within this region, has been an ability to work together for the greater good. And it's great to hear you say that that is coming through very visibly now. And to go back to an earlier statement you made, if you put student safety first, it's pretty hard to go wrong.
Exactly.
I said at the beginning of this program that I was thrilled that President Ken Gormley from Duquesne University would be here to launch this series with us. Now that I've had the benefit of his thinking, I'm even happier than I was before. So I really do want to thank you, Ken, for doing this, not just for us, but for all of the people who would like to know more about the constitutional framework within which decisions are being made and actions are being taken. We're very grateful to you.
Well, I appreciate it, Mark. And I think it's a great public service that you're doing this series, and hopefully we'll be able to get together before too long for a live version of it.
Well, that would be nice too. Our next remote version, I should say, is going to feature a person who has been on the front lines and a person who was just mentioned by President Gormley. That is Allegheny County Executive Rich Fitzgerald, who has done a marvelous job in many ways as our county executive, but who, as Ken said, has stood out again during this particular time of difficulty. And we'll be talking to him about, how his life has gone for the last couple of months, but we'll also be talking to him about, the perils and the satisfactions of being caught between the state and municipal leadership, about the extent to which he has relied on the health science professionals in the county health department and in the other institutions here in Allegheny County in making his decisions. And we're also going to talk to him about the new processes that have been put in place for the primary election next month, because big changes have come to our community in that regard too. So we hope you will be with us for that next program as well. And again, I can't thank Ken Gormley, Duquesne University president, enough for being with us on this first program. Thanks again, Ken.
Thanks, Mark. It's my honor.